This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hello and welcome to the 13th episode of the Sports and Society podcast. In this episode, we will discuss Chapter 14, Sports in High School and College. Do competitive sports contribute to education? Your hosts, as always, are Jake Oakley and Jeff Montes de Oca. Good morning, Jay.
Good morning, Jeff.
Well, like good sociologists, we have discussed the relationship of structure and agency throughout the episodes of this podcast so far. And that's where I want to start today. As a reminder for folks who are listening, or you might not have taken Intro to Sociology, we tend to define agency something like this. It's the meaningful choices that people make over their bodies from within a limited range of options. Social structure, or the institutional organization of society, that's what gives us those range of options. And so what that means is any kind of change in structure can give more or less agency, open up, close down choices. Okay. I'd like to talk about this in terms of school sports, Jay. Specifically, what are some of the potential impacts of schools organizing sports rather than students or communities organizing sports?
Well, there's a number of different possibilities here. Some are positive and some are negative. But I really want to preface my response and remind everybody who's listening, especially the students, that the United States is the only country in the world that has an interscholastic sports system that is funded, focused on, and supported by the schools themselves and controlled by the schools themselves rather than by any of the participants. And the scholars and students that I've come across from other countries are really shocked when they come to the U.S. and they see how U.S. high school and college sports are organized. And they immediately start asking some critical questions about that organization, just like you just did. And from my experience of working in England, I spent 2 academic years working there and teaching and doing research. And I had a chance to see how they organize their sport teams. And I even played on one of their so-called school sport teams. And just real briefly, they would have 4 different sport teams representing the school in a sport. And when they called and arranged a competition with another school, the number 1 teams from both schools would compete. The number 2 teams, the number 3 teams would compete against each other and so on. And they were coached by the players. It was all player control. The players handled all the transportation and all the other things. So there was no eligibility requirements, although there were some general guidelines. So basically, we are living in the United States in kind of a unique situation where when it comes to agency, the schools have taken over decision-making. The coaches have taken over decision-making. Even some of the trainers, where they exist, have taken over decision-making. And the athletes are following rules and obeying commands. And if they don't, they get in trouble. So that kind of a structure, that kind of a context is unique and is very different from similar high school and college teams in other countries. And And it really restricts the team members' experiences in some really important ways. They're not making decisions. They're not the ones calling timeouts. They're not the ones drawing up a play. They're not the ones figuring out how to get in shape and train. And in the process, they may not be learning the same kinds of things that they could be if agency was more in their possession.
And there's really a very specific history to this, which I've actually written about. This is no coincidence. And the point was to control students.
Yeah.
Because if we think about the origin of collegiate sports, it was student initiated.
Yeah.
The very first football games were started by students, played on school quads on the grass, right?
Yeah.
And then, Walter Camp graduates from Yale. I think he went to Yale, and he starts coaching. Well, he actually was coaching as a student, but then he comes back after graduation and he coaches. And the games get bigger and they become spectacles, and the institutions decide the spectacles are getting out of control. Plus, students really like them, and so they could be used for marketing. And so the schools start increasingly taking over more and more and more control. And this starts in the 19th century. And by the early 20th century, the schools are very much in control of student sports. They have paid coaches who are full-time coaches, and the games are played in facilities that the school has funded and built. Mm-hmm. So the institution has tremendous control over the sports, which means they have tremendous control over the students' bodies and the choices made over the uses of their bodies. Mm-hmm. And as you said, Jay, if school sports are extracurriculars and educational, there's a whole range of education that is shut down by the very organization of the sport. Again, it's that question of structure and agency. And thank you for highlighting that so clearly. Here's another basic sociological idea. Most of us take the world as it currently exists as a given, right? We see the social structure as natural and inevitable. And in fact, I'm sure a lot of people reading Sports and Society never question the fact that school sports are highly controlled by schools, and that schools have sports, right? They have organized sports, as you said, which is, in fact, unique, and it has a very specific and maybe 150-year-old history, right? And the reason that we don't question is because the world, we're born into it, and likely the world won't be too different when we leave. So we're born into it as it exists, and we leave it largely as it exists. In my lifetime, in the lifetime of most of the students reading Sports and Society, high school and college is both a place and a time that centralize sports participation and consumption. So the institutional link between sports and education can seem natural and inevitable. Can you elaborate on this relationship between education and sports?
Yeah, well, I think that socialization, going back to some of the history you've mentioned, is a key factor here, because in the early part of the 20th century, the United States was full of immigrants, a high population of an immigrant population. The young people, especially the boys, in those immigrant families, were spending a lot of their time on the streets. They had to be acculturated and controlled, like you said. So the schools started their school sport programs to do a combination of acculturation and control. And the great sport myth was basically emerging at that time, that sport was pure and good, and that anybody who participated in it shared in that purity and goodness. And that was defined as an educational experience. So there was this taken for granted connection with learning and socialization that was never empirically tested. It was just assumed. And uh, right now, if you go back and try to find studies that critically assess the relationship between education and participation in sports, or sports generally in the schools, you're going to be hard put to locate really good studies that identify the conditions under which certain kinds of outcomes are most likely to occur, educational outcomes in particular. We don't know that. And with all the research that's been done on school sports, that should be the first thing that pops out. How do we organize them in order for education to occur? And if you look at the way they're organized right now, is there ever a final exam, on a team? And by final exam, what I'm talking about is questions about what you've learned. Are the coaches ever assessed the way teachers are assessed? Are changes recommended after the tests given to the students and the coach assessment? There's nothing that resembles what goes on in the classroom on the sport team, but we just assume that the coach is learning to be a better teacher, that the students are learning all of these things that are valuable in their lives, but we don't know the conditions under which those things are most likely to occur. Now, with that said, I want to make sure that especially the students who are listening understand that there's a lot of diversity when it comes to high school programs and college programs. And there are some programs that really do pay attention more closely to educational issues in connection with sport participation. But in my experience, they're generally in private schools rather than the public schools, or they're in small schools where a principal and an athletic director have come together and done something on their own. It's probably not a system-wide thing. But anyway, we don't know the connections there like we should. So that's one of the big problems. And, the students don't know anything about the budgets, about the school resources that are being used, about how they're privileged in certain kinds of ways, and so on. So, those kinds of things are part of what should be the education.
So we assume that sports and education just kind of naturally and inevitably go together because our schools, for most of us in our lifetimes, have always offered sports. I was shocked when I did research on physical education and learned that so much of the PE classes I experienced in school were formed in the 1950s in response to conditions of the Cold War. But one of the things, amongst others, that I'm hearing from you is you're questioning the naturalness and the inevitability of sport and education being paired the way they are in our schools. So maybe you can talk a little bit more specifically. What are the ways in which sport and education might actually be in tension or contradiction with each other?
Yeah, I think the clearest example is related to health and wellness. I went through a high school program, a college program, and I never had anybody tell us about why we were doing all of these things and how it related to my long-term health and wellness and well-being. And we could have had the biology, physiology faculty come in and do a seminar with us and talk about why we're training the way we were. And in other sports, like football, for example, you could have somebody, if you're playing college football, the coach could have a neurologist from the med school at some of the big universities come over and talk about head impacts, talk about protection of your joints, your ACL, the biggest injury that men and women have in college sports, and talk about the things that they know from their academic perspective about injury prevention and protection. So, but that never happens. And it's so logical for that to happen. So there's all sorts of things that could be formally included in your sport experience that would really pay off for health and wellness. And, you could have somebody from business and a leadership program come in and talk about leadership issues. And then you would start learning about what you needed to experience in order to develop your own leadership skills. Because I never heard that from a coach. So, and even the trainers that I worked with, they didn't tell me about how to protect my ACL or other part. They gave me a shot of Novocaine when I had a bone bruise, but they didn't tell me about what Novocaine or cortisone could do to my bones if I kept doing that the whole season. So, the logical things related to the learning that could occur that maybe you wouldn't get graded on in your other courses would be very, very valuable. In fact, that's the stuff that I would need now. And, anybody who's 25 years old would need.
One of the things I think about, what's at the heart of the way that sport is played today in most of our schools, right? What's like the governing logic there? Competition and spectacle.
Yeah.
That's not what's at the heart of education.
Right.
Right? And so the kinds of choices we end up making, because sport can be very expensive, particularly if you're talking about football, gridiron, American football, right? It's extraordinarily expensive to, even at the high school level, to host those games. And so then choices have to be made between investing in sport, investing in education. You hear about high schools with multi-million-dollar stadiums, but their textbooks are out of date.
Yeah.
Right? There's all these ways in which the goals of one can be antithetical to the other.
Yeah.
I mean, if we think about like who gets the most playing time, the athletes that are the most developed and they learn the most. Well, that's opposite to education. If there was really an educational mission in our extracurriculars, then the players who are the least developed might get the most playing time, but that would run totally contrary to the values of competition.
Yeah.
So there's all these ways in which these things that we think of as naturally and inevitably tied are actually oftentimes contradictory and running at odds with each other. And then we have to figure out ways to negotiate those contradictions.
Yeah. And let me just give you a quick example, especially for anybody who's read the chapter on deviance in sport, where we talk about deviant overconformity and deviant underconformity. And deviant overconformity is basically looking at the norms of the sport ethic, sacrificing the team, playing with pain and injury and so on, dedicating yourself to excellence and not accepting barriers. And the individuals who overconform with those norms are praised by coaches. And, it would be very helpful for a coach to say, wait a minute, we've got to look at setting limits on the extent to which you conform to these norms, because you can go overboard. These norms are good, they focus you and so on. But when you go overboard, you're stepping into dangerous territory that could affect the rest of your lives. So let's think about what we're going to do here to set those limits. And that would be one of the greatest learning lessons in terms of your physical health and wellness that you could have in a high school or a university college sport program. So those kinds of things are just not done.
Jay, I want to go back to a point you made a little bit earlier. And one of the things you said is there's actually great diversity in college and high school sport programs. So there's a range. And we tend to focus on one of the extreme ends of the range. And I have a question about that I'll come back to later. But a lot of the research on sports impacts on education, right, if it advances the goals of education, assumes that playing on school teams has the same meaning in all contexts for all athletes and therefore must have the same consequences. What would you say are some of the limitations of this approach to research?
Yeah, I think that conclusion is related to the fact that we focus so much of our research on the elite programs, the elite high school programs, the D1 FBS programs in football, and the D1 programs generally across sports. And we assume that all the D2 and the D3 programs are presenting student athletes with the same kinds of organization and conditions. And that's not necessarily true, although there is a trickle down. And that trickle down leads to, I think, having a lot of the D2 and D3 and the smaller high school programs trying to mimic some of the bigger programs. And that's a problem. But I've seen schools, especially high schools, that still have teacher coaches and by the way, colleges used to have teacher coaches as well. The coaches used to be members of the faculty at some universities.
And have student coaches.
Yeah, right. That's right. And so the teacher coaches come with a pedagogy that's a little bit different than the so-called walk-on coaches. And that's where some of these programs started to change and resemble the elite programs, where the trickle down really occurred, because that's the model that they had always seen as the epitome of high school or college sport. And so we're hiring coaches now who have no other connection with education. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is that athletic departments are completely separate from the rest of the structure of the school, whether it be a high school or a university. So they have their own little fiefdoms in a sense, and the accountability and transparency is really low in many of those programs. So it's very difficult to police athletic departments effectively, because so much of the stuff occurs remotely in private conversations, at practices here and there, after a game and so on, where you can't be, checking things out. So basically, the cultures that exist in those programs have developed around a set of orientations and perspectives that don't necessarily match the perspectives and orientations in the rest of the school.
I have an example of that. When my younger son, just before he started high school, it was one of those open houses where you get to tour the school and talk to teachers and such. And so we, of course, made a point of talking to the athletic director, and she was very excited about the football team, the tackle football team. And she was very excited about clubs, particularly the rugby club. And I brought up a flag football club and asked, do they have one? And she was, no. And well, what if my son wanted to start a flag football club? Because honestly, he could have been the starting quarterback probably by his sophomore year on their football team, mostly because their football team wasn't very good. But he could have been the starting quarterback probably sophomore, if not, for sure his junior year, if I would have let him play tackle football. And he didn't actually want to play tackle football because he was familiar with the research on it. And the athletic director was really uninterested in a flag football club. And I was really surprised. And I brought up the fact that, reflecting on her enthusiasm for tackle football and rugby, the fact that the research is pretty clear about head trauma. And her response was, I don't believe it. And I'm like, oh my God, you are the athletic director in a public high school, and you have an incredibly anti-intellectual attitude towards research. And it's exactly what you're talking about there, how disconnected an athletic department can be from the mission of the school itself. So one of the things I want to talk about, and we a couple episodes ago when we were discussing media coverage of collegiate sport, we brought up this idea of the social construction of reality, right? The way in which information can circulate to create an image of the world. And as people always say, perception is reality. So that's what we know. This is impactful here because a lot of people view the elite levels of school sports, specifically collegiate sport. I'm thinking like the football bowl subdivision and other, programs that are going to be in those particular schools as typifying collegiate sports. So I was wondering if you could talk about how media fosters impressions such as this, to create this image of only the elite as the sport, the expression of sport, and how it might be more accurate.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've got to remember the media are commercial organizations. And if anybody's paid attention to some of the news about media rights right now and the whole impact of cord cutting and streaming, we've got all these mergers between media companies so that you can see something on TV, you can also stream it. And so the media rights are going through the roof. And basically, the media, regardless of how you consume a college football or basketball game, the emphasis is, like you say, is on spectacle. But one of the things that they're a little bit sensitive to when they're doing college sports is at least in the past, they used to have a special halftime thing where they talked about maybe an academic program. And just to remind people that these people out on the field or on the court were actually students, because there was nothing else in any of the broadcasts that would remind you of that. So they did give kind of this token acknowledgement that we're dealing with schools here, but that was as far as it went. And that's one of the problems. When you consume things through the media, you're doing it through the optics and the orientations of media people. So they're trying to give you as much excitement as possible and get you emotionally tuned up to hear the commercials and maybe believe the commercials and so on. And it has nothing to do with a connection between education and sport. So that's one of the main things. They don't talk about, for example, any of the debt that even the D1 FBS schools are going in, and how much student fees are increasing because of the athletic department debts. They don't talk about the money coming from the general fund, the taxpayers pay. And so, you learn nothing about the real side of college sports when you watch it on TV. So, and they don't tell you how many students have just left the library, even if they were, if they were there. And for the rest of the day, they're going to be having a few drinks and cheering for the team and blowing off whatever education things they might be doing on the rest of a Saturday and Sunday. So, those are things that we just don't hear about in the media.
So while we're on this topic of elite collegiate sports, particularly FBS, and we're thinking in terms of structure. Well, we're seeing in real time right now the structural landscape of collegiate sport changing, starting at the top with the FBS schools, and that's going to have impacts on the second tier, third tier, all the way down to Division II, Division III schools. And some of those big transformations include name, image, and likeness, the conference realignment. I'm still struggling with the idea that the Pac-10 that I grew up with doesn't exist anymore. Issues around the portal, so the ability for students to move around between programs, and then the potential issue of paying athletes. Well, Jay, how do you make sense of these changes? What are what impacts do you see this having on also high school and youth sports? So let's just start at the top level, work our ways, sort of down conceptually. I don't actually think high school sports is below collegiate sports. In many ways, it should be it's above it in terms of impact on people's lives. But in any case, we'll start at the top and work our way down.
Yeah, and this has all these changes are related either directly or indirectly to the commercialization of big time college sports, and it's also related to the inability of the NCAA to maintain any kind of control over what's going on in big time college sports, or to inject a focus on education in connection with those sports, despite the fact that there are faculty reps and other things that kind of connect the NCAA directly to universities, but that has no impact on the way education is connected with sports. So now what we've had, because of some legal cases where the NCAA has been found to be violating antitrust laws. Why are they violating antitrust laws? Because the big time college sports are economic activities, and there should be competition, open, freer competition in those activities, not just among the schools, but for the labor. So, that's creating the value within those programs that are now generating considerable revenues. So basically, what we have now with NIL and conference realignment and the portal and so on is we have something real close to unregulated commercialism. The NCAA has stepped back and said, we can't do anything. And who has stepped in? Collectives, boosters and local people who have emotional and financially vested interests in having the local teams win at the university level. And those collectives took advantage of the name, image, and likeness issue back in 2018. They just first started then. And they started dealing with issues of recruitment and retention on their own outside the boundaries of the university. And the university let them do it, and the NCAA let them do it, because then Title IX didn't apply. So, so these collectives were operating on their own terms, and they started wheeling and dealing with recruits and with existing players to keep them, at the university if they were good. And the university stepped back. Now, the athletic department had some insider backdoor information about what was going on, and now they even have coaches attending those collective meetings with recruits and current athletes. So, and once the TV rights were renegotiated, the conference realignment was a no-brainer. Which conferences are getting the best TV contracts? The Big Ten and the SEC. So then schools from other conferences jumped and then schools from the current Pac-12 or the old Pac-12 jumped into one or another conference without any thought about the travel from coast to coast for all the teams at the university, the impact that that would have on education, on the time that students had to devote to education and other things in their lives other than sports. So it was all a commercial kind of a quest, and it became an arms race, and everybody was trying to outdo everybody else. Well, then the legal case on paying as athletes as employees comes up. And let me tell you, if we go to a pay the athletes a salary, it's going to open up a Pandora box. And there will be all sorts of unanticipated things related to that. Now, I'm not saying I'm for or against it right now, but, and there's various ways that it could be done. But right now, intercollegiate sports have changed dramatically and formally into a totally commercialized, mediated model. And the athletes have gotten into that model as influencers. And that part, the NIL, the name, image, and likeness part, and the influencer part has filtered down into high schools. Now, high school athletic activity commissions are approving nil contracts for high school students. And the middle school and elementary school students have parents who are saying, we got to get a nil contract when you go to high school. So what we're going to do is we're going to create videos of how great you are, and we're going to make you an influencer so that when you hit that point where it's legal to do, you're going to start getting some contracts, and you're going to be making as much as I am, son, daughter, because you're going to have these great contracts. And it's going to get you into a university and so on. So it is filtered down. I've seen 7 and 8-year-olds now who are being filmed by parents to prepare them to be influencers.
I'm baffled.
Yeah. So, and the other thing that I didn't touch on is the portal. You know, the portal, the rules have just been falling like dominoes, where it used to be that you couldn't transfer at all. And now you can transfer, I think, an unlimited number of times. Maybe there's a limit of 2 right now, but in some cases. But you can transfer. You don't have to sit out a year and waste a year of eligibility. All of these things. So students, like last year in Division I basketball, half of the college basketball players in the United States in D1 programs entered the portal. Now, if you're a coach and you've coached somebody for 2 years and given all that you have to that athlete, and now they've entered the portal and they're going to take everything they've learned to one of your competitors, you're not a happy coach. So, we've got dissatisfied people here all over the place, but they've got no choice but to use the portal like all the other coaches are and get the best players you can.
So there are many ways to go with this. I'm going to try to restrain myself because there are a lot of topics I'd love to bring up here, but let's bring it back to the focus that we've had so far. And one of the things that you've outlined is yet more ways in which the commercial competitive logic of sport is inconsistent with the educational mission of institutions. That they really run, they're in many ways antithetical to each other, particularly when we're talking about these really elite programs.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be. And I think that might be something that we see. Because there are many aspects to what's going on right now that we have seen in the past. And I think about like after the 1984 Supreme Court decision, Oklahoma versus NCAA, that deregulated football broadcasting, and it allowed for an elite tier of, universities. I mean, there was already an elite tier of universities, but they could further separate themselves from the others, and that created the ground for later the football Bulls subdivision, where there was already a Division I, but then there was a splitting within Division I, and so you had the elite in Division I and everybody else in Division I. Well, when it comes, and it looks likely that there may be paying athletes, most schools are not going to be able to afford that. I mean, most schools are not Alabama or Notre Dame or the University of Southern California or Michigan, right? We can just keep going down the list of these really top programs that act. And one of the things you alluded to that you didn't say explicitly, and so I want to make a point of this. Most colleges lose money on their football programs. Most colleges in the United States that have a football program lose a lot of money on their football programs. And the way in which they make it look like they're still in the black, that these are revenue generating sports, is what you did mention, Jay, which is the student fees, the drawing from the general fund. In no other business, and it is a business, in no other business could you engage in those kinds of accounting practices and call it legal and get away with it. But they're able to maintain this claim that that football funds all of the other sports. And so what's going to happen is there is going to be a tier of semi-professional sports programs, and then it'll be interesting what happens to all of the other programs that are not in that very elite tier, whether they're Division I, Division II, or Division III. And I always look at the model of the Ivy League in the 1950s, when the schools that created American football could no longer compete with the land-grant universities, big public university, and some private schools like Notre Dame and USC. They stopped competing with the top schools. They only competed with schools like themselves, and that created really exciting competitive football. They could still carry on a tradition of football spectacle, but they didn't have the same kinds of scholarships and things of that nature because they could not compete. And I suspect something like that will happen in broader in collegiate sport, that will actually have true amateurs, not the kind of quasi amateurs that we have now. And then we will have actual paid athletes. And just by the way, one of the reasons why most schools can't afford to pay their athletes is, and particularly the football players, one, it raises all sorts of Title IX issues, but specifically with football players. One of the things that the universities do is they externalize the long-term healthcare cost of playing football by not offering workers' compensation. Right. That's why Walter Byers came up, I think it was in the 40s, I think it was in the 1940s, he came up with the term student athlete so that football players would not be eligible for workers' compensation, and that saves the institutions a ton of money. Well, the big schools will be able to afford that, and people will keep watching collegiate sport. But the smaller schools, between the Title IX issues, the costs of football, they'll have to do something very different.
Yeah. And even some of the big schools are going to have to drop sports, because especially the ones where the travel expenses are going to be extremely high, and coaches in some of those sports are now making a lot of money. And so, one of the problems is that there may be some athletes who are going to benefit, but there's some athletes who are going to lose out. And in terms of anything, even a scholarship. So because the sport is dropped. So that's why I said it's a Pandora's box. We don't know what all the unanticipated kinds of consequences are going to be there. And, my sense is that some of the big programs are going to have to split off, and not just split off as a whole athletic department, but have two or three sports split off and play at one level, and then have other sports play at a D2 or a D3 level. And so you'll have three different categories of athletes within the same university. Now, that already happens in some schools where, you can have one sport in a D3 program play up to a D1 level. And hockey teams sometimes do that, at some of the smaller schools in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and so on. But we're going to see all sorts of reorganization occurring that are going to have a major impact on scholarship issues, on educational issues, on student agency issues, some positive, some negative maybe. But we don't even I can't even guess what they're going to be.
Yeah, the two sports I've seen that with is hockey locally here, Colorado College. It's a Division III school, but they have a D1 hockey program.
Right.
And also I've seen that with wrestling, Division III schools with D1 wrestling. I think one thing we can count on, because this has been the general trend of the history going back to the 19th century of collegiate sport in the U.S., fewer and fewer schools and fewer athletes will be taking a larger and larger share of greater sporting resources, including the financial. Mm-hmm. And then more will have to split less.
Yeah. And one of the positive outcomes possibly is the revival of club sports. And, you've talked about it. My granddaughter played rugby at Oregon, and it was totally student controlled. She learned more in that situation that she had learned in all of her organized soccer programs and rugby programs in high school. And, she's going to a wedding this weekend, and 12 of the players from her rugby team are showing up because as they were planning together, traveling together, making all these decisions together, they formed relationships that I never formed when I played on a college team. So, they carried over. So it's a different experience. So maybe that will be one of the positive things. Now, that will cater to upper middle class families because, people who come from middle income and lower income families are not going to be able to afford to pay their own way to college unless they have some other kind of help. And by the way, that even trickles down to high school, where we haven't talked about it, but social class is becoming much more important now. If you've had access to the training, the private coaches, the pay-to-play programs, you're much more likely to move up the pipeline and get the benefits that you can get higher up, if there are benefits, that other people are not going to have access to. And it's going to be a socioeconomic phenomenon. It is now, but it's going to become more so.
Right. So I do want to keep focusing on this line that you brought up, the class in high school sports. And we talk about H.G. Bissinger's book, Friday Night Lights, which personally think was far superior to the movie or the TV show. I actually really love that book. And Doug Foley's work on football in Texas. Right. One of the things that those books, which particularly, the Bissinger book is a really easy, fun read because he's a much better writer than most of us academics are. They really show how sport can operate in a community. What are some of the things that you see as what do you see as some of the major advantages and takeaways of community-based research on sports, such as Bissinger's and Foley's?
Yeah, that's a great question because many of us in academia, when we study interscholastic sports, we're focusing on the school. We're not focusing on the entire community. And Foley's book is a real exception to that, and it's a great book. And Bissinger's book is like you say, just a good read, and it gives you an idea of how these athletes fit into the community, how their families are connected with sport, how the community is connected with the sports, and the various issues that are raised in connection with those connections. And we need to know more about that. And I think maybe when this Pandora's box is open, and people start thinking more creatively about how to organize high school and college sports, we'll start putting them in a larger social and cultural context and start thinking about them as community activities as well as school activities. And we don't know enough about that. We don't know enough about how race and ethnicity, for example, and gender from the local community, and sexuality from the local community carries over into high school and college sports, and vice versa. So all of those things are yet to be explored, and that's an important issue that we in the sociology of sport probably haven't had the funding to do, but it's something that should be done.
I want to ask you something else, and we've brought up Title IX before, and there have been some tremendously positive impacts of Title IX since the early 1970s. I mean, the rates of girls and women's participation in sport has just, grown incredibly since then. And yet, we haven't achieved gender equity in sports. What are some of the potential ways you see to fostering greater gender equity in school sports?
Yeah, that's another good question. And if we're talking about the way sports are structured right now, I would say it's crazy not to have more mixed gender sports and teams. There's no reason that individual sports can't all be gender mixed. And what you would do is you'd have to develop, in some cases, new scoring uh, uh, frameworks for some of those sports. You would have to have certain kinds of rule changes if you're talking about team sports. There's no reason why a volleyball team can't be mixed gender. And, we talk about preparing students for the future. Well, the future for most of us is going to be a mixed gender future, and a mixed LGBTQ cisgender future. And so to mix people in those ways, in our high school programs especially, but college programs too, is a great way to prepare people for the future. So it ties into the education issue that we've been talking about. Why is sex segregation so prominent that it's created all of this political stuff related to trans female athletes, and which maybe could have been muted a little bit, or we could have learned all sorts of things in the past had we had more gender mixed or mixed gender sports. So that would be one of the ways to move toward equity. Now, just because you have a mixed gender sport doesn't mean you're going to have equity within that sport. You've got to be sensitive to those issues as well. I think that the big issue is power within athletic departments and high school activities associations and so on, where more women have to be in positions of power and control and decision making, and they have to feel free to participate in the discussions related to decisions, just as the men feel. So I keep hoping that we're at a pivotal moment right now with all of the focus on certain women's sports, where women are being recognized now as knowing what sports are all about, while they're still players, and they're developing reputations that are going to transcend their graduation. So are they going to become the coaches in the future? Are they going to be bringing an orientation that's more gender equity oriented than the current coaches have done? I'm not sure, but I'm hopeful that changes are going to start speeding up because changes in the power sphere have been so slow.
Well, again, what we're talking about is structural transformation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And certainly neoliberal capitalism has led to this unregulated commercialism in collegiate sport, as you were talking about, right? And so the market logic has, to a very large extent, taken over collegiate, and particularly at the elite level of collegiate sports. And we had that whole discussion. I think a question then is, and we've raised it each of us slightly differently, is what other structural changes is that going to lead to? And I think on this particular point, like with your argument for more gender mixed sports, we would need to think about sport differently. We would need to define sport differently than we do now, because right now, as we've already said, it is centered on competition and spectacle, and trying to develop the most elite, the highest level of competition, even if that's going to be increasingly impossible for more and more schools. That is the logic right now. And so when I've discussed this with student athletes, they'll say, oh no, gender mixing in sports just doesn't work. A cisgendered male was saying, when I was in when I was in middle school, I could, outcompete high school girls, and then the women would say it's no fun to compete against men because they're so, I can't compete with them. They're too fast and strong and all of those sort of things. And so oftentimes the athletes themselves are going to resist mixing because of their very conception of what sport is. And I think this gets to how might we be able to change our very notion of sport itself, given it has developed over the last 150 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, you could just add up times. You don't have to have people competing head to head. You can take the times of the men and women on your team, add them all up. And if your times beat the collective times on the other team, you win. So that way, the men on the team, if they are stronger, they're pushing the women. And the women are not feeling bad about it. Because their times count just like the men's times do. So they can help win, even if the men's scores don't beat the men's scores from the other school. So anyway, there's ways to get around some of these things. And we just, like you say, we're so focused on the spectacle and the commercial aspects of things that our creativity has been stunted.
Yeah, I think one of the things that needs to really happen is rethinking the relationship between sport and commercialism within school sports.
Yeah.
And the changes at the top may actually help that. If they really do pull out of, say, the athletic department, they become, as some people have suggested, that they become their own institution connected to but separate from the school. That way they don't have the same regulations that other school programs have. Again, it's the logic of the market, right, running wild. In some senses, I'm like, well, that's a really terrible thing. But in the other sense, it might liberate schools from the market a bit, which has not been the case since the late 19th, early 20th century. We're running out of time here. Let me squeeze one more question in. And this is related to what we've been talking about, but also different. As I said, when I was talking to the athletic director of my son's soon-to-be high school, he has since graduated from that high school. Repetitive head trauma is a really serious issue in a lot of school sports, not just football. I mean, even things like bobsledding has very high CTE rates, and you wouldn't at first think that bobsledding does, but you think about how their heads bang around. And I'm not saying bobsledding is a major school sport, but there's a lot. But point being, a lot of sports, repetitive head trauma is a very serious issue. So maybe you could talk about some of the larger social issues arising from making high-risk sports part of a school's educational mission.
Yeah, I've had a hard time with that for a while, ever since some of the research started coming out on the repetitive head trauma. And, it's so antithetical to education. And it relates to, one of the themes that we've been developing. How do you connect education and sport in some kind of a systematic and more formal way? And one of the first things is you look at the research. And if the brains of your athletes are being harmed in ways that compromise not just their education, but the rest of their lives, I can't think of a greater disservice to the individual student, but I can't think of anything that's more antithetical to education than that. So now, if I'm saying let's reevaluate football in American education, I'm going to get so much resistance that I'll be run out of any room of the average, high school spectator, coach, whatever. I've already been run out of some of those rooms for saying something like that. But that's a tough one because of all the vested interests associated with those sports. And the only way to get at it, I think, is to go through the back door with education of the athletes themselves and let them start thinking about those issues and demanding agency in connection with them. That's one strategy. Another strategy is to sponsor seminars that doctors and neurologists and others come in and talk to parent groups in youth sports first, but then middle school and high school sports as well. And because parents are making a lot of the decisions here, and already parents are pulling their kids out of football in a number of states, and we need to just spread that education and knowledge around. It has to be kind of an organic grassroots effort because the resistance from vested interests is going to be so strong that the only way to combat it is to have the parental decision makers, coming to the table.
And that's such a theme that runs through all of sports and society, which is, you say parents as decision makers, athletes as decision makers, making sport more democratic, more participatory, and not participatory in the sense of the actual leadership of the sports itself.
And more humane.
That's right. Right. And people can make decisions for themselves. Do they want to treat their bodies well? Do they have if the knowledge is available? And that's what the research shows, is that for families who are aware of the risks of playing football, they're far less likely to sign their children up for it.
Right.
There's exceptions to that, of course, but that's what the research is pretty clear about. Well,
and real quick, by the way, the athletes who make that decision, the male athletes, learn more about masculinity issues as they're going through that decision-making process than they will in a lot of other contexts. So, and that will change them forever.
That's right. And that also points to, if we have more mixed gender sports, how much will the male athletes learn from female athletes? And, yes, the guys might be bigger and stronger on average. And I say that on average, but that doesn't mean they're any more competitive, driven, or mentally strong than the women athletes.
Right.
And that's a good lesson, right?
Yeah.
A good experiential lesson.
Okay.
Well, with that, we better wrap things up. In our next episode, we're going to discuss Chapter 15, Sports and Religion. Is it a promising combination? Which I'm excited to have that conversation.
I am too. So that's been something that I've thought about ever since my young Irish Catholic upbringing.